So I'll give you a quick overview. I will start with what is BlackberryOS 10, what are the components that it is made of. Then we'll look at ground zero, which is QNX 8. We'll look at examples of possible local privilege escalations, the remote attack surface, persistence on the device and monitoring facilities, as well as isolation that is called BlackBerry balance in this scenario, and I present some quick conclusions. Okay, so first of all, traditionally BlackberryOS from BlackberryOS 4 to BlackberryOS 7 has been running on some weird embedded operating system that is proprietary to RIM. On top of this operating system, you have a Java virtual machine, and all the applications that are running there are actually Java applications in a weird format. Now, without any exploits, there was no way to run native code on the old BlackBerries. This even held for malware. I think there was one example of BlackBerry malware that is documented somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and that actually was written in Java as well. So later on, RIM decided to add WebKit to stay competitive with other touch-based devices. This was when the Torch came out. And in order to do that, they had to add a POSIX layer to the platform, which looks really, really weird if you reverse engineer it and see how that is pieced together. So in Pwn to Own 2011, when we first attacked the BlackBerry, that was the thing that we went after because WebKit has a great attack surface, and this POSIX layer gave us the at-home feeling. I mean, you could have gone after other things as well, image parsing and other things, but this just was more convenient. And with BlackberryOS 10, things have completely changed, and you're feeling even more at home now because RIM, or BlackBerry as they have called themselves now, have started using QNX as a foundation. So QNX is an embedded operating system that before was, the main use of this operating system was in cars, in telematics units, and other embedded devices. Then at some point they were bought by a company called Harman, and later they were bought by RIM. Now, for the smartphone environment, there's some significant augmentations to QNX. And on top of the kernel and the user land, you have a very weird mix of things running. So there are parts of the personal information manager that are written in Python. So you have like a mix of Python, Qt stuff, and Adobe Air applications running on the operating system. For instance, the settings application and the weather application are written in Air, as I think is the engineering screen, which we'll go into later. Moreover, there is an Android runtime for which you cannot install APKs directly, but you need to convert them into so-called bar files. Doesn't work if the app has native code. And it turns out that many of the applications in the BlackBerry world these days actually are converted Android applications. Okay, so before we continue, I'd like also to give an objective of this talk. So I've thought about this a little bit, and I actually really like the architecture. So this talk is not about dropping wild O-days on BlackberryOS 10, but rather to try to give you an understanding of the architecture and look into some undocumented corners. I see some advantages and some shortcomings compared to other smartphone operating systems that I'll go into. And I have decided not to look into the proprietary architecture that is the BBM and the BES. I have looked somewhat into that, but I then saw that this would be like another talk if you want to do this in a detailed fashion. There is some very good previous work by Zachlanier and Ben, sorry for writing with 2 N, sorry, typo, Ben Null about void camping the BlackBerry playbook. So in principle, the playbook was apparently like the testing platform for RIM, and the BlackberryOS 10 is a direct descendant of tablet OS, as it was called there. So for the playbook, there exists for all the versions a so-called Dingleberry jailbreak. I actually had to look the meaning of that word up, and then I was rather disgusted. So how that works is it uses the fact that the backups are not signed and uses the backup restore process to override a Samba configuration file, and using that you can execute commands as root. Then there is a slide deck that recently appeared, I think like 1.5 months ago, by Alex Plaskett from MWR, who looks into various corners of BlackberryOS 10. And then also there is a BlackberryOS Z10 research primer by someone called Alex Antuk from Zec Consult. This last one is a little bit confused in some places. I try not to rehash the information that these people have given, except where I need specific things to explain something. So like if you want to know more, I urge you to look into these presentations and resources as well. Okay, so again, what's QNX? So QNX is a POSIX compliant microkernel. The last standalone release that you can download is version 6.5. And for tablet OS, version 6.6 and 7.0 are underlying, but these are not available outside of RIM as far as I understand. And there's another interesting thing which is called the QNX Car2 platform, which is will be used by Porsche in Bentley, and this is also based on QNX 8. Now there was a period of time that the source code was openly distributed, not in like an open source sense, but like you had to register and download it or check it out from the SVN between somewhere in 2007 and some 2009. And you can still find copies of that online on some Chinese sites, or I think I found mine on some Brazilian university FTP server. And that is actually, if you want to dig deeper into the kernel, that is a very, very helpful resource, because then you don't have to reverse engineer the whole thing. There have been numerous changes, but it's good to know what the starting point is. So what are the responsibilities of this microkernel? This is very basic. So as microkernels work, they only have very basic functionality. So what this thing does is basically message passing, memory management, process management, and debug and tracing if you have instrumentation enabled. Oh, and process loading, of course. Now, device drivers, file systems, and networking are not in the kernel. All that runs as user space daemons. So if you look at it, you have this thing down there running in ring 0, and all of the things. I mean, these are just examples that will run on these phones. Of course, there's lots more things going on. But I think all of them except for the menu service run as root as well, which is kind of important. So they all run in user space. Then there's something that if you're used to POSIX operating systems but you've never seen QNX before, this will look weird for a second, but it's a very important mechanism in the system. This is the QNX persistent publish subscribe system, which basically gets mounted into root PPS, and this gives processes and threads on the system asynchronous communication abilities with persistence beyond reboots. So in QNX, the data that is stored here is usually binary. For QNX 8, in BlackberryOS 10, they actually have JSON encoding all of that data. I think the same was the case in the playbook as well. So this is also a central storage for many system settings. Think of it also like kind of like a registry for some things as well. Here from the Windows world. Now, the really interesting thing is how they have solved the challenge of granting fine-grained permissions. So every smartphone operating system does this differently. Some don't do it really at all. But for instance, like Android has these intents, and you can grant fine-grained permissions, for instance, for the camera or address book when you install an application. And how BlackberryOS 10 has a gazillion permissions, and how they're actually mapped to the operating system layers by a process called authman. And this basically maps the permissions or capabilities to access control lists. So someone apparently here was a really big fan of the POSIX 1.2e ACLs. So if you look at the file system, like every second file on average will have an ACL attached to it. And in most cases, that's actually done dynamically by authman. And how this works is by the application requesting permissions through a device, and authman granting them according to configuration files which are stored in etc authman. And in these, you can actually have like macros for other things. So for instance, if you want access to the personal information manager, I think, or private or personal information manager, then you have this access PIM, right? And this gets expanded to these macros, some of which you see down here, and also to PF rules. So BlackBerry or QNX 8 integrates the OpenBSD packet filtering framework, and authman dynamically, if you give certain rights, will insert filtering rules according to these rights. So as you see, you get two new rules for localhost, and you get to access 2 files additionally. Okay, so the methodology for analysis. If you want to start out, you want to start out with something where you already have root, right? So the easiest way to do that is to take the BlackBerry device simulator, which is actually a VMware image, and that's basically the whole thing compiled for x86 instead of ARM. And by just opening the VMDK files in Vim in binary mode and editing a couple of bytes, you can get yourself root in there. Then there is so this tool didn't exist when I started, but now there is a tool called Sashezi, I think that's how it's pronounced, by some Crackberry forum member, xSasha. And with this, you can basically generate download URLs for the system and for the radio files for all of the different versions of BlackberryOS 10, so all of the different carriers. So you just give it like an MCC and MNC, and then it gives you the URLs for that particular firmware, and the model, of course, because I mean there's several different models of these, and then there's the one with the two models with the keyboard. And the second step was to enable development mode on the device, and then you can log in as SSH as dev user. So what I did for BlackBerry Balance, I was actually somewhat, when I read the documentation for the first time, I was actually quite amused because the minimum requirements for the instances are, I think, like over 16 gigabytes. And you need to, at least to the documentation, you need 3 of them. So I spun up 3 EC2 instances and wasted a couple of dollars for a week. But I mean, there's no other way to test this because there are no, for BS10, there are no trial setups that I'm aware of. And you can't actually test BlackBerry Balance without having a Best 10 server. The good thing that there's a trial license for this. Okay, so after I had done that, the next step, because I really care about memory corruptions, I had to look at the exploit mitigations on the platform. And they're actually quite good, except for one thing. So they have a toolchain with ProPolice built in. They use data execution prevention, so the XN bit on ARM. They have full ASLR, so the system binaries are pi-linked. The toolchain also builds pi binaries by default, and they have full Ralvo on the ELF binaries. I didn't notice any heap hardening. I mean, I had expected some, but there doesn't seem to be any at the moment. Okay, so then I thought, okay, starting with a memory corruption is probably a little bit overkill. So let's have a look at what other things there are on the platform. And there's this crate directory scripts that I really encourage you to look into. And one example, also, this is nice because it shows the advantage of the microkernel, and I'm not giving you away a root escalation on the platform. So there's a program called PIDIN, which is the bastard PS on QNX. And this doesn't, as many other utilities on QNX, it doesn't filter the output. So you can actually have things like backslashes so you can have character returns and semicolons and shell meta characters and everything in the output. And there's like this script USB host. And this takes the output and it assumes a certain format, which of course doesn't work anymore if you have a program that contains a carriage return already. And using this, you can kill other processes running as USB manager. Unfortunately, they don't run this as root anymore because this RIM USB manager Nile, so Nile is the platform apparently for this, it executes this shell script after having dropped privileges. And this actually saves the day here. There are many, if you look at this directory, you will notice other similar things, and in some cases with greater potential than just killing processes. But what I started noticing was that from 10.0 to 10.1, RIM really seems to have realized that running so many things as root is not a good idea. And in each release, you see that they take some away. And this really mitigates these kind of problems. Okay, so let's look at the remote vectors. Obviously, you have the installed applications. You have browser bugs and WebKit. If you take like just look at the version of WebKit that they're using on the platform you're attacking, and then you look at trunk, and then you look at all the test cases that are in WebKit trunk for reproduction of various memory corruption vulnerabilities. That way you can easily find something. And they work without problems on that platform. But you need another privilege escalation to make something with that. There is the media synchronization tool, which I found interesting. So this is called MMSyncLite. I find that particularly interesting because this is something for basically generating thumbnails of all different multimedia files that drop on your platform. And this runs in the background, and obviously it needs to parse those image files. That's another vector, and of course there are the direct vectors IP version 4, and I was actually surprised that it also supports IPv6. Proximity-based, you of course have the cellular baseband, the Wi-Fi, processors in the Wi-Fi firmware, Bluetooth, and NFC as vectors. Now for IP, that's really interesting because I noticed several crashes in their IP stack, which I think in the year 2013 shouldn't happen anymore. I'm still investigating that. It seems to be IPv6 related, and it's totally unclear to me at the moment whether it's exploitable. But when I looked at that, for the first time I realized what the advantage of microkernels for the offensive side is. Namely, the networking services and the drivers will be restarted for you. So that makes exploitation a lot easier because it's not just a one-shot anymore. So if you screw up, you can try again. I have to warn you though, you'll see this later, if you fool around with that, make sure that you're not logging everything to RIM. We'll talk about that in a bit. So for the baseband, there are different configurations of this Z10 available. I have looked at the other device, and the Z10 seems to be the only one where this is the case. And all of the handsets except of the STL100-1 use Qualcomm chips. But this STL100-1 uses an ST Ericsson Thor cellular chipset with a TI-OMAP application processor. I think this is because initially when they start developing the platform, they had these Def Alpha devices and they're all aware of this exact same chipset combination. And this actually runs the old Nokia stack that was bought by Renesas and licensed to Sony Ericsson. The problem is the baseband division of ST Ericsson now is defunct. They don't develop anymore. They kick out all their people. And this handset still is sold in Southeast Asia, the MENA region, and Turkey and Spain. From the baseband difficulty levels for an attacker, it's significantly easier to attack this one than to attack the Qualcomm chipsets, because as far as I'm aware, currently there are no published techniques for wrapping on hexagon. This is a typo again, because I was confused of the models. At the moment, I would advise to stay clear of the STL100-1. The difficulty levels of exploitation from the baseband side to the application side are a completely different story. I haven't looked into that, just like general observations on the baseband itself. From what I've seen, and I've heard people from RIM claim to me a different thing in the past, there don't seem to be any modifications of any significance from a security side to the baseband source that they have. So it matches really, if you bin diff the baseband binaries, it matches other vendors. Okay, now, after a while, I ran into this interesting facility hidden in the engineering screens. So The engineering screens, if some of you have toyed around with Blackberries, you will be familiar with them. This is basically a special mode where you can look at, like, say, your cell environment or various parameters for Bluetooth and so on. And for that, you need to have a code that is derived from the pin of the device, basically the hardware identifier, a time period that is translated to a long string, and then they use some secret that is derived, I think, from Doctor Who, with a SHA-1 MAC to generate, I think, an 8-digit number that you enter, and then you basically unlock this engineering screen. And I was very surprised when I looked at this engineering screen on this device that they have something called remote lock collection. And this is if you reverse engineer the services for that, you see that this is controlled through a PPS system QUIP. So I would have actually never looked into that, because in my notes I had this QUIP thing down as QNX instrumentation something services, which sounded totally uninteresting until I ran across this. And then you look at this remote lock collection, and it looks a little bit like the problem that Carrier IQ was in the past. You basically can capture screen, or in certain cases, screen captures can be made. They allow you not to notify you when these diagnostic events occur. You can have raw memory captures. You can capture voice and audio, and this sampling of network traffic is actually running TCP dump for an hour and then sending it back to RIM. I was not amused at that time. Now, however, then you look more deeply into that, and you see that this is linked to something called libforensics.so. And this is actually, these are the functions that this library offers. And this hooks into the BBM application, into the camera application, NFC libraries. There's something called a thermal flight recorder, apparently, so to log the thermal data of the handset. And sensor services, which, funnily enough, from this I found out that they have a device for face detection, And then the question for me was, like, how easy is it to actually enable this? And it turns out that there's actually some cryptographic protection for this. And there's several classes that you can be in. You can be a RIM employee, can be a carrier tester. And they have tokens that are signed and verified. Actually, they're signed a little bit obfuscated. The tokens that they store are a little bit obfuscated and signed. And I found it somewhat curious that the path that they have for the individual tokens is the downloads directory. So if you accidentally download something as QUIP-auth, then the next time you can be introduced to this logging facility. And if no valid token is found, there's a list of different carrier tokens that is tried. And also there's an override property that you can use to force enable this, apparently. And then you look at example tokens just to see what the general setup of these is. And they have a field called auth activation message, which is very nice because that way they inform the user that this is being performed to them. However, this is not something that will be displayed in general. This is something that is set in the token. So if I want to enable this without without displaying the message, then I can just send a token like this to the user, and no message will be shown. And the really interesting thing is that most of these processes that deal with the crypt functionality also are running at elevated privileges. And for instance, there's something that there's a plugin for this quip that looks at the crashes, and it looks at critical crashes. And crashes are stored in var log, and they're stored according to the process name that has crashed. And again, there's no filtering going on any of the characters, so the proc name may contain shell meta characters as well. And then you see that this crash monitor does various dances with these log files or these core dump files in var log that that all involve executing system. So this is not only useful for logging, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Okay, that was the fun part. Now let's talk about the more problematic part. Initially, I had strong hopes that persistence on the platform would be hard because the device is a trusted boot device. So the system binaries, when you boot up the device, will be verified according to a chain of trust. And there's actually a file for that for the bootloader to verify. However, if you compare the code verification that they claim to have, then you see that the code verification is not actually going on at the binary level. So it's not actually binaries that are verified for installed applications, but basically the code verification happens at install time of the application. So in some other presentations, people claim if you're a dev user, you can copy binaries to the system and execute them, but that's not true. If you're any user, you can copy binaries to the system and execute them. It's just you can't, unless you have some exploit, you can't install forged packages easily. But you can totally get binaries on the system that remain there, and then there's another trick that you need to do to get them executed after every boot. So persistence on BlackBerries at the moment is significantly easier to achieve than on last generation iOS devices, because on iOS the verification actually is on the page level of the binaries, right? So it's actually the loader and the kernel that work together. But it's somewhat, if not significantly better than for most Android phones, as you're probably aware of. Okay, last but not least, we'll have a look at BlackBerry Balance. And BlackBerry Balance is the solution that they have for separating your phone into two environments. They call this parameters or domains, depending where you look. And basically, you can have a personal parameter in which you have your Facebook, Twitter, whatever, all of your Angry Birds. And then you have an enterprise parameter, which is connected to your corporate network, where you have your corporate applications and your corporate email and so on. When I saw this for the first time, I was wondering, hey, how does this work? I mean, why do things show up in the BlackBerry hub from both sides? How is this integrated? And then I looked into that, and it turns out that the implementation is actually just by having different user IDs and group IDs for both sides. So basically, if somebody gets root in the device, it's game over again. So initially, I had hoped there was some deeper mechanism involving trust zone to make the separation, but this turned out not to be the case. And the perimeter manager is the thing that actually implements all of this, that that gets the policies back from the enterprise server. And this basically translates the security policies to things that are usable for the rest of the system, for instance, to Authman configurations, and also allows for optional two-factor authentication with a smart card. But I mean, really, if it's sufficient to root the device, I don't know why you need a smart card. You also have separate networking environments for both the enterprise and the personal perimeter, and encryption of both the personal and the enterprise data as possible. Now, the advantage of BlackBerry Balance is that it gives the administrators a lot of policies to force on the average user. So, for instance, he can disable camera and stuff like that, or disallow things like Facebook. As a real security mechanism, I don't have very much faith in it at the moment, to be honest. Okay. Overall, however, I have to say that using a microkernel is much, much saner than getting bitten by kernel vulnerabilities in features that you don't use. I think there were several of these lately in various Android versions. However, the fact that the platform security fundamentally hinges on privilege escalation exploits not to be possible. I don't find that very comforting. And moreover, the fact that they don't have any other mechanisms to prevent that if somebody is able to escalate, that another fail-safe mechanism kicks in. For instance, you could have something like a trusted MAC or trusted BSD where you restrict system calls. This I find somewhat discomforting. So the fact that the only way of sandboxing that they have is through user IDs and group IDs, but there's no finer granularity. This I find somewhat problematic. And with this, I'd like to close, and I'll answer questions. Yes?
Is the only sandboxing protected for what is called BlackBerry Balance? So we have one personal app and read the contents of another personal app?
No, it can't. So because I actually wasn't talking about apps at all, but apps will be generating different, so installation of an application on the device will trigger generation of a new group ID on the device. So if you have two different applications, they will live with two different group IDs. So the problems only arise if somebody gets root on the device. And the other thing I'd also like to point out, which is not, I think it's not very relevant now, because I think there are enough ways to escalate to root still, but the other thing that you have to account later when this gets harder is that you can also follow transitive patterns where you can escalate from one user ID to another, and this user ID gives you rights to other things, and then you can escalate more. But this is not something that people would do at the moment. So escalating to root seems easy enough. Yes.
Two questions. One, can a user opt out of quit? Did you notice? And two, you mentioned that if you exploit WebKit, you need a privilege escalation exploit.
Yes, to make some use of that, right? Because you don't get any data.
So I was going to ask, is the user, the UID you're using for WebKit, is it really to have very granular ACLs, and you're really not allowed to report generic, like low privilege app?
It's a low privilege user ID, but I mean it can see parts of the system, but it cannot read any data.
And what about
Quip, you can disable it if you go to the engineering screens. I haven't found out a way of testing whether Quip is enabled for you without actually going to the engineering screens, which I find somewhat disconcerting. I hope that all the cases where they enable Quip, they show to the users. But I don't know that at the moment. Yes?
I want to ask another browser concern. Actually, it's WebKit based, but is there any isolation within the browser, like tab sticker processing?
Yes, I mean, so they have different user IDs, but not any isolation that was meaningful to me. So not like, for instance, WebKit 2 or Chrome. So the isolation seems to be more from the logistic side of rendering things. Yes.
You said once the root, if you get root privilege, game is over. But how is the root detection mechanism in BlackBerry? Is it if you root the device, if BS server will immediately detect somebody rooted this device, the root detection is not.
I haven't seen anything, but I mean, once you root, the only thing that is protected from you is the kernel. And I haven't seen anything in the kernel that would try to do any kind of detection that the device is jailbroken, and I haven't seen any daemons that try to detect that. But if you have daemons, then you can easily defeat that. It would only be meaningful if you had this in the kernel. Yes?
Do you have anything that indicates that the quit isn't off by default?
No?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear that. Sorry.
BlackBerry balance, I think what I heard you say basically is that there's no real separation geographically between the personal side of the device and the enterprise side. So the encryption is really like one set of keys for the whole device, right? It's not separated out.
No, so things are encrypted separately, yes? But the thing is, once you have root on the device, you can also get the keys for that. That's the problem. So they will use different encryption keys for the personal side versus the enterprise side. But the problem is that, once you root, you're able to debug the process that is using those keys. See? Sorry, can you repeat the question, please? Yes? Honestly, I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But that's a good question, actually. Thank you. Yes?
Do you know if it went QMX8 has a sample of the leaks?
I don't know. I think people behind you would know that. So I actually have to say that I briefly looked at the encryption mechanisms of the platform. This is also why you don't see anything in my slides. The encryption mechanisms, they look perfectly fine from what I've seen. The problem I see more in the system security side.
And all the things from QNX come
I haven't seen anything, no. But that would be interesting, yes. Okay. Any more questions? Yeah.
So I've also just looked at BlackBerry for the short time, but I see what happens is that when you put it into developer mode, it does start kind of a web service that you can
Yes.
also get. And what I saw is obviously you can't just, if you go and make a normal connection to it, get to it. And what I saw from taking the simulator and the binary, that it obviously there's some user agent that they look for.
This is actually interesting. So there's, okay, but go on, sorry.
Yeah, so what I say is that obviously they use the web service that you're allowed to actually push apps using what they call, obviously using Samba.
Yep.
Like if you had that to push the apps on. And you were saying that there's kind of no key-based protection. So how would I maybe go into that? Because I'm looking into ways to use the web service to maybe see if I can push malicious apps through there or see if I can find vulnerabilities from.
So wait, you have like a heap exploit that you.
Well, it's basically the question because if you log on as a dev user, obviously the dev user can't access say slash applications. You actually look at all the installed applications and all that. And just if you push obviously you have to do the web service to do some, but it obviously does get installed. So that does seem like a high level of privilege happening.
Yes, correct. Yes, so the QCon, so there's a couple of web servers that are running, and there's a daemon called QCon which is responsible, and the QCon actually is running as root. If you SSH into the device, what happens is that QCon actually starts a thing called QCon door. And this depending on which key you authenticate with, will give you either dev user, or there's a different 1024-bit RSA key that can also give you root on the device. But I understand that's probably what RIM is using to develop on the devices. But that definitely is a service that is worth looking into. As for the web servers themselves, I noticed. So some of them that are exposed are the so-called Bosonic HTTP server, and they were running as root in 10.0, but they're now running under their own user IDs in 10.1, and there's apparently a different mechanism to make that happen. What you described when you push an application. But I mean that's what I was saying before. Iteratively, they try to take privileges away from all high privilege daemons that are running on the device. Did I answer that question, or because I'm not sure, because I haven't gotten into the heap part, but I didn't quite see the relation as well.
You mentioned that you didn't see any heap-based protection, so
yeah, so basically. Yeah, so what I was saying is like usually, no, well not usually, but other operating systems these days have heap hardening mechanisms where they basically make heap metadata corruption harder, or where they have cookies for the pointers to make sure that people cannot easily screw with the allocation mechanism, but this I haven't seen on this platform. Yes.
Other than the UID and various applications, what is the channel thing you think would make this better?
Sorry, what would make this better?
What is the channel thing you think would make this better other than the UID and various?
Well, so although the number of system calls on QNX is greatly limited compared to, say, Linux or any other more monolithic operating system, I still think it would be a good idea to restrict for things like a render process, like for WebKit, the things that it can do. So in principle, if you have a render process, the only thing that you need to do is you need to compute a little bit, you need to read input, you need to write output. So that's just 2 system calls for you after you've set everything up. So this is, for instance, the seccomp the idea of the seccomp sandbox under Linux. So this, something like this would be a good idea, or the more fine granular thing that you have with ACID Linux or with trusted BSD and trusted Mac, where you actually attach paths or objects to system calls and basically have policies that say, okay, if I execute this program, I will only allow this program to access this particular path space and only these system calls. Yes. Okay. More questions? Yes.
What I'm seeing in some of it, that if you look at Windows, say 8, they've got maybe a runtime broken service that actually holds what the communication between now the meta-control app. And what I saw on BlackBerry is the app process obviously containing the app or the BlackBerry store apps that are running, or
Yeah.
the actual app or the mobile app. Is there a way, or have you looked into getting a router maybe around the app process so that it can maybe look that into GD and actually see how the process actually pulls in the mobile application and then puts it into, like when it executes, how you can actually analyze it from backwards?
I haven't actually looked at applications at all. So I have looked at the privileges that applications have. I haven't looked at the inner workings that happen when you install an application beyond looking that the verification looks sound. So, but I understand. So you can, I think you can look at the Void Camping slide deck. They have done some looking into that. And I think, from what I know, most of that still is relevant. So Tablet OS and BlackberryOS 10 are actually rather close still.